The responsible center in American politics is gone, and that's quite regrettable. The extent to which our politics has become dysfunctional from the standpoint of really not taking care of the people's business.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. That voice was James Baker, former chief of staff under Presidents Reagan and Bush Sr., and he was a former U.S. Secretary of State. He mourns the state of affairs in Washington where political parties are at war. And under Trump, the war became a violent street fight at the Capitol. Because Trump didn't work well with his own Republican Party, let alone the Democrats. And Trump is gone. President Joe Biden knows how to bridge political differences, and there is hope in Washington. He can get the nation back on track, but the challenges are big. On this Backstory, we talk to the author of a new book on James Baker titled The Man Who Ran Washington. And we talk about the man who almost ran it into the ground, Donald Trump, and the challenges ahead for Joe Biden and the media. All right, to understand what is going on in Washington, or understand it as best as we can, let's talk to Peter Baker of the New York Times, who has just written the book, The Man Who Ran Washington, and he wrote that with Susan Glasser of the New Yorker, and it's about James Baker III, the former Secretary of State, former White House Chief of Staff, and power broker. How are you, Peter?
I'm good, Dave. How are you?
You're living in crazy town.
We live in a crazy town. That was in fact the phrase, that was the word. It was used by John Kelly, who was President Trump's second chief of staff, to describe Washington these days. Crazy town.
Wow. And he was up to his neck in it. And
he knew all about it.
You know, just watching the impeachment hearings and everything last week, which I want to talk to you about. But first of all, on this book, congratulations.
Thank you.
James Baker. I mean, a lot of people who know politics in the U.S. will know him. But a lot of people won't remember him. And I remember him so well because, you know, all of our fates as foreign correspondents turned on Baker's ability to go through the Middle East and talk to Gorbachev of Russia and try to put together this incredible coalition. I guess it was 1990 when Saddam Hussein had gone into Kuwait and put together this coalition to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. And you imagine now, in modern political times, anybody trying to do what Baker achieved, in Mission Impossible.
No, I think you're right about that. I mean, the coalition that he helped assemble with George H.W. Bush to push Iraq out of Kuwait was unprecedented. They had the Soviets on the same side as the Americans. They had the Syrians and the Egyptians and the Arabs part of this coalition. They had the Israelis, the quiet part of the coalition, staying out of it to avoid alienating their Arab neighbors, but going along with what Baker asked them to do, which is to keep out of it as much as they could. They had, the Europeans, and they had all of the people who have fractured so much in these last 25 and 30 years, all on the same page. It is hard to imagine that happening today. But I think it's one of the reasons we wanted to do this book was because it's the story of Baker himself is so interesting. He had his hands involved in so many interesting things. But it's also a story of Washington and how much has changed. We were going to call this book The Man Who Ran Washington When Washington Ran the World, right? Because it was this unique moment at the end of the Cold War when America was supreme and had, fewer challenges around the world for a small period of time. The title was a little long for the cover, so we didn't go with the full full version. But that is the thrust of the book, right? The Man Who Ran Washington When Washington Ran the World.
So Susan Glasser, in one of your interviews, said, remember, this is a study in power, and power doesn't always look pretty up close. So what was the ugly part of that power play, do you think, during his time?
Well, the ugly part of power from Baker's story is the acquisition of power, right? So I think Baker's story is the story of the acquisition, exercise, and preservation of power in modern world. And getting power doesn't always look pretty. And in particular, it would be the 5 presidential campaigns that he ran, some of which got pretty ugly. The 1988 campaign stands out between George H.W. Bush and Michael Dukakis still to this day is one of the ugliest campaigns we've seen in modern times. Bush, who otherwise was a genteel fella, and Baker, who generally was a person who valued civility and mutual respect, went all out to beat Michael Dukakis, this sort of mild-mannered technocratic governor from Massachusetts. They turned him into a flag-hating, Pledge of Allegiance, despising, criminal coddling, lefty liberal. And so that wasn't a very, pretty moment, I think, in American politics. But what's different is that's what all American politics seems to be these days. Whereas in Baker's time, once the election was over, the election was over, and it was time then to govern. I was
just going to say there's some reconciliation at the end of the process, according to Baker and according to some of the things in your book, right? That you fight like hell during the election, but after the election, then you have to come together and try and get things done. Although he did talk about this great division in Washington and the increasing inability to get anything done.
Yeah, it's so different today, right? Back in Baker's era, you did the dirty, grubby things you had to do during elections in order to win. And then you did that in order to govern. And today it seems like it's the other way around, that you get into office for the purpose of winning the next election, that your time as a president or a senator or a congressman is all spent thinking about what you can do during the term you have in order to succeed at the next vote count, rather than using the votes that you've won in order to accomplish something of lasting value.
I think the Washington Post wrote about your book, and they were quite flattering about it, and deservedly so. But they said Baker played hardball, yet within limits, that he didn't seek to challenge the fundamentals of the political system or its institutions the way that President Trump did. What do they mean there?
Well, look, we think of Baker for a lot of things. One of them we think of as the Florida recount after the 2000 race. George W. Bush and Al Gore basically came to a virtual tie. And it all came down to Florida, where they were separated by just 357 votes after the first machine recount. And so Baker led Bush's effort through that recount, won the battle at the Supreme Court. A lot of Democrats still bitter about that. And a lot of Democrats think that was kind of, dirty pool in some way or another, that the election was somehow—
This was the whole hanging Chad controversy.
Hanging Chad and all that. But the difference is, I think, actually what you saw from that to today is how different it really was, because there was a genuine question about who won then, and both sides did fight it out in the courts as vigorously as they could. But when it was over, and both sides accepted the result. Al Gore gave a very gracious concession speech at the end of the day. So I didn't agree with the Supreme Court decision, but George W. Bush is now my president. George W. Bush and Jim Baker and his sides were very gracious toward Gore and the Democrats, and say, Bush is going to be the president for all Americans, not just some Americans. And I think that's the difference. They believed in the system. They used it. They fought in the system to prevail. But when it was over, they stood the system up, not try to tear it down.
And why did they do that? I mean, was that a sense of tradition? I mean, obviously, if you're a statesman, you put nation before your political interests, or after you fight it out in the appeals in the courts, then you say, okay, let's have a peaceful transition of power. But do you think that they did that out of tradition, or do you think they understood the dangers of not doing it?
I think all of the above. Tradition, right? A healthy respect for the system, that the system has to have rules in the end. You have to have guardrails in the end. Otherwise, it's chaos. Otherwise, it's not really a democracy. I think that they believed, that there were limits, and that you did not cross those limits, whether they were legal limits or just, traditional limits or, normative limits. And I think that they had that fundamental belief in the system because of how they were raised, when they were raised, the times that they were raised in. And Trump has basically shown that the limits that we thought existed on the presidency and that existed in the democratic system in many ways were advisory rather than mandatory, that they can be, in fact, crossed with impunity. And if you have the capacity to win support from your supporters, your base, your backers, it's not always easy to stop it. And
that's the scary part of it. That's the scary part of it, right? Because we always used to go around talking to, people in Russia and other systems, right, and say, yeah, but America it's just not about goodwill politics at the end of the day, that they have decent checks and balances with an independent media and independent judiciary. And all of a sudden, all of that just went, it didn't go poof, but you could see how fragile it was.
I think fragile is the right word. We saw in the last few weeks and months, especially, but maybe even over the last 4 years and beyond, that the institutions that we thought were immutable in Washington and in the United States in general are in fact fragile. They in fact can be broken if that's what happens. Now, you can also take the more optimistic point of view and say, in the end, the system held up, right? In the end, courts looked at what Trump tried to do and say, no, we don't believe that. There's nothing here. This is nonsense. And these were judges who were Republicans as well as Democrats. These are judges who were appointed by Trump.
But it turned on a threat, right? I mean, you look at that phone call with Georgia. What if he had said, yeah, okay, I'll find you another, whatever it was, 11,000 votes.
Exactly. Brad Raffensperger acted with, obvious integrity in the face of enormous pressure from the leader of his own party. And what if that happened that he wasn't Brad Raffensperger, but somebody else who didn't have the same strength and courage of conviction or what have you? And you're right. I think we've learned, a lot about that. Now, what do we do about it? I don't know. That's going to be for the leadership to decide, if anything. We're in such a fractured moment, in such a polarized time, that there isn't sort of this larger consensus that we need to fix the system the way there was, say, after Watergate, when the 1974 class came in and people said, let's start some reforms going here.
Did he really tell you that he thought Trump was crazy? James Baker?
James Baker, he did. Yeah. See, Trump is the anti-Baker in so many ways, and we're doing this book before Trump came along. We started this book back in 2013 in the misty days of the Obama era, because we also thought Washington was still broken then, and partly. We thought that Baker's story would help us understand why it was broken even back then. Then Trump comes along. And so all these conversations we're having Baker for the book, often get diverted into conversations about Trump because we were so curious about his views. And Trump is so much the anti-Baker, both in terms of ideology. His version of republicanism is very different than Baker's, but also in terms of, I think we just talked about, respect for the system, the idea that there are limits, the idea that you have a certain degree of integrity and that you work across the aisle and you respect the other side, even if you're competing with them. These are things that are not Trump's, leitmotif, right? But they are Baker's. So why, in the end, was Baker's Republican Party turning to Donald Trump? We tried to explore that through his eyes. And he said over and over again, right, this guy, I think this guy is nuts. I think this guy is crazy. He told us repeatedly. He had a lot of criticism of him. And yet in the end, he voted for him. So why did he vote for him? Because he says, in the end, I'm a Republican, even if my party has left me. And I think that tells you a lot about the modern Republican Party and about America in general right now. It's a tribal moment in America where people stick to their side, skins and shirts. We know which team we're on. We're sticking with our team for the most part.
Although some of the polls that came out, like the ABC poll just came out, said 58% think that Trump should have been convicted. More than 3/4 of the Republican Party, though, still, sticks with Trump, right? So, yeah, you still see the tribal, but there are some pretty big fractures and cracks appearing where, 28% blame him for the riot. Is this the moment where the party doesn't stick like glue? And there's going to be, some people have said there's going to be a holy war inside the party.
Well, it's a great question. We had a good story by our colleague Reed Epstein in today's New York Times about Adam Kinzinger. Adam Kinzinger is one of the Republicans, members of the House from Illinois, who voted against President Trump, who voted to impeach him, and has been a very outspoken critic in recent weeks in particular. And his own family, 11 members of his own family, signed a letter to him, a 2-page handwritten letter to him, basically saying that you're an embarrassment. You joined the devil's army. Trump is a Christian, and you're signed up with the other side, and we basically disown you. And that's how, you're right, that's how fractured things are right now in the Republican Party, because literally families are being torn apart over this question of President Trump. And we'll see where it leads. We don't know. I mean, in some ways people say this looks like the 1850s when you had the emergence of a new political party for the first time. Could it be that we, after 150 years or more of stability in the two-party system, see something different emerge? It's possible. It's possible. We'll see. I think for the moment, though, you've got a very, very fractured Republican Party.
Yeah, two-party winner-take-all politics, as somebody wrote in analysis today, said that it's fueling a calamitous zero-sum toxic partnership, that it's really time for the emergence of a third party. But can you tell me, because you're the expert on American politics, why has there never been a real third party run?
Well, the system is built to resist it, right? The system is built to protect itself, and it's a two-party duopoly, and the two-party duopoly has, defends itself through various laws, like ballot access laws, like fundraising laws, like, all kinds of campaign-related laws that make it really, really hard for another party to emerge. And even when you've had people with great means like a Ross Perot come along and create a third party, which existed for 2 or 3 cycles. It didn't have the wherewithal beyond money to last beyond the great personality of its leader, right? So that's, to build a party, you need to go beyond the personality of a single individual like a Donald Trump, perhaps, and to build something more lasting and sustainable. We haven't seen that in American history since the 1850s. Even Teddy Roosevelt, as popular as he was, tried to create a new party, the Progressive Party, called the Bull Moose Party. Once he was off the scene, it no longer went anywhere. So the structure mitigates against a third party. It doesn't mean it won't happen, but I wouldn't expect it.
And does Trump fade away, or does he get tied up in, give me your prediction. Does he get tied up in maybe criminal investigations? And then, like the NAACP has announced today that they're going to sue Trump and they're going to sue Rudolph Giuliani. He's got a lot of civil actions coming his way. Does he get ground down in the mud, or does that even propel him, fuel his desire to run again in 2024 even more so?
Yeah, I don't think he's going to fade away entirely. I don't know that means he ever runs again, but I think he wants to continue to have a place in the system, to be a voice in the party and to direct things. He particularly, I think, would like to, take revenge against those Republicans who, in his view, betrayed him, if he can, in the 2022 midterm elections, for instance, to primary them. That's the verb we use now in Washington. In other words, to mount a primary challenge against Republicans who he thinks are disloyal to him. And it really does tell you about this party, because it is about personality as much as anything else. At that rally on the day of the attack on the Capitol, Donald Trump Jr., the president's oldest son, gave a speech, and he's excoriating establishment Republicans, saying it's not their party anymore. It's the party of Donald Trump. And that's really telling, I think, because that's, a political party isn't supposed to be about one person. It's supposed to be about a set of ideas and a set of interests and a set of constituencies. But they have tried to make it a party of one great personality. And that has been successful because he has had such support among many Republicans. But whether that lasts, whether that goes anywhere, I don't know. And you're right to point out the legal issues, because there are all kinds of criminal as well as civil exposure that the former president has right now that could be real problematic for him.
I sit around and scratch my head a lot as somebody who's worked in media for 40 years. And I watch, this great fragmentation down the rabbit hole to Looneyville and of, the QAnons. And now, instead of just, in addition to Fox News, now there's even more right-wing cable stations that are popping up, and disinformation is, turbocharged, right? And mainstream media gets so much criticism and comes under the microscope, almost like they somehow breached their oath because they got something maybe that wasn't completely 100% right. So I'm obviously a fan of mainstream media and of the New York Times and great institutions like that. But do you see any exodus from, people who are drinking this ridiculous Kool-Aid that in part has been fueled by President Trump and the whole fake news movement? Is there any good news on the horizon that way, or is it very hard to return from this now?
Well, I think it is hard.
Sorry for that question.
No, it's a good question. And I think it goes to the heart of what's going on here in some ways. A lot of it is about media. When you and I were growing up, when you and I were starting out in the business, you had the 3 big networks, you had CNN just starting, you had the big newspapers and news magazines, and that was pretty much it. And today, the great, wonderful, amazing benefit of the new information age also has a dark side, right? So the proliferation of new media sources on the one hand is great. A marketplace of ideas should be as broad as possible. But it also means that we have fragmented our media in such a way that people, stick to their corner of the internet where they feel most comfortable, where their preconceived ideas are reinforced regardless of facts. And I think that that's true on the left and true on the right, especially obviously, as you point out, on the right now, where Fox is now seen as not conservative enough by some people, which is pretty remarkable.
Would you have guessed that a year ago?
No, of course not. And because of that, you have people living right now in very different fact planets. And they don't even start with the same set of facts, right? When you and I started off, we started off with the same set of facts that Walter Cronkite and his generation would tell us. And then we would argue about what they meant and what we should do about them, right? But today, we don't even start with the same fact set. We're living in completely different universes.
Do you feel
that I think is a big problem.
Do you feel in mainstream media because of Trump's lies and the spin that all of a sudden we all found ourselves in this movie where they were, he would come up with some ridiculous statement, and it wasn't a question of the old rules of balance that you and I grew up with was, okay, well, you got the reaction from the Democrats, right? So, but by then the damage was already done. So suddenly we had to reinvent the wheel a little bit in terms of how we did fact checking and reporting. Do you feel that left-wing media or mainstream media suddenly found themselves having to be the official opposition to Trump all the time, and we were pushed in a very uncomfortable corner? Or do you feel that we're still doing balance?
Well, I think that was the danger of these last 4 years. It is our job to speak truth to power. It's our job to fact check. It's our job to provide, real truth to people when people in power are telling them the opposite. And so by doing that and doing that aggressively, which I think is what we decided we had to do, our mission, it made us look like we were in the opposition when we're not, and we shouldn't be. And I think that was what Trump wanted. He wanted us to be the opposition. Why does he call us the enemy of the people? Because he wanted to discredit us and make the mainstream media look like political opponents, no different than the Democrats. Well, we're not the same as the Democrats. And now, of course, you're already seeing Democrats complaining when we write things or say things on TV that they don't like about Biden.
We need that, right?
Yeah.
Because that shows
exactly.
We're hated equally. So.
Well, exactly. But it doesn't mean that Biden is the same as Trump. We're not going to say, we're not going to play some false equivalence and pretend that Biden is the exact same as Trump. He's not. We're going to cover him aggressively with accountability, because that's what we do, and it will be appropriate and proportionate to this, what he says and does, because that's what we should do. But we were never in the resistance, and that was always the danger, is that we would look like we were, and he wanted us to. And so I think that was, I'm glad that part of it is over. But because people are so polarized, they assume, if you write a tough article about a politician, that must mean you are politically X or Y, and it doesn't. It just means we're journalists.
Is there a final question to you? Is there a retreat? Do you feel a sea change now in media and its interaction with the White House?
Well, look, this is a White House filled with people that we've all seen before. Most of these people were in that White House before under Obama. So it's kind of a return to, a more establishment set of people who understand how the game and the rules work, at least as they used to work. And so, we ask tough questions. Again, we're getting excoriated on Twitter by our friends on the left, just like we got excoriated by our friends on the right for asking tough questions. And the question becomes, well, how can you ask him that when Trump did this? Okay, well, we covered when Trump did this, and we covered it aggressively as we should. It doesn't mean we're not going to also cover President Biden aggressively. Again, that doesn't make Biden the same as Trump. These are not equivalent. But we will cover him the way he should be covered, as any president should be covered, because otherwise we're falling down on our job.
Peter Baker, so generous with your time. You've co-authored the book, The Man Who Ran Washington, about James Baker III, along with Susan Glasser, who co-authored it with you. It's great. Read the book, and always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great to talk to you. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
And that's our backstory on Washington and politics in America. And I'm now publishing a newsletter on Substack.com, danalewis.substack.com. And I try to lead you through some of the big stories of the day and recommend what you can read on the news of the day. Sign up if you like. It's free, as is this podcast. And all I ask is you subscribe and share it. Thanks for listening to Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis, and I'll talk to you again soon.